HOA thought they could control my parking spot until I owned the road and made their street unbuildable. You know what they say. Some things are just too small to matter. But what if I told you? A parking spot was all it took to bring down the whole system. A tiny little rule. And yet, the HOA thought they could take control. But they didn't see what was coming. What happens when the rules turn against them? When you fight back and own the very street they walk on? Keep watching. Because what I did next, it'll make you wonder just who really holds the power here. Welcome to HOA Secrets Uncovered, where every neighborhood has its secrets, and I'm here to uncover them. I'm Mark, a regular guy just like you. I live in UK, where I've dealt with more HOA drama than I'd like to admit. By day, I'm a doctor, but by night I'm here sharing the stories of the little guys who stand up to the system. Now, sit tight, because this story, it starts with a parking spot. But it ends with something you wouldn't believe. I thought it was just another normal day. I woke up, got my coffee, and headed outside to get into my car. It was just a regular morning, or so I thought. But that was before I saw her, Mrs. Clayton, the HOA president. She was standing by my parking spot, a smile plastered on her face. But there was something off about that smile, something in her eyes that made my stomach churn. Her eyes were cold, calculating, like she knew something I didn't. I pulled up to my spot, and she didn't move, just kept staring at me, like she was waiting for something. I rolled down my window, tried to greet her normally, but I could tell she wasn't interested in small talk. "You're going to have to park somewhere else," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I froze for a moment, trying to process what she just said. I had been parking in that spot for years. It was assigned to me when I moved in, and there was never any issue. Until now. I looked at her, trying to figure out what her angle was. "What do you mean? This is my spot," I replied. She didn't even flinch. "I know," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "But the board has decided. We need to make some changes around here." I was getting that sick feeling again, that something wasn't right. "Changes?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What changes?" She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I can't go into all the details right now. But your parking spot will be reassigned. It's for the greater good of the neighborhood, you see." Greater good? This wasn't about the greater good. This was about control. I could feel it. Her eyes were locked on mine, daring me to challenge her. I didn't back down, though. "Why don't you show me the official paperwork for this?" I said. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to let me know she wasn't pleased with my question. "Well, you'll get it soon enough," she said, her voice still calm, but now with a hint of annoyance creeping in. "You'll just have to move your car, for now." I could see where this was going. She didn't care about rules. She didn't care about anything but her own power. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Okay, I'll move it. But I'm going to need an official notice from the board, signed by everyone. Otherwise I'm parking here. Got it?" Her smile slipped for just a second, but it was enough to see how annoyed she really was. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. "You'll get it." And just like that, she walked away, still smiling that fake smile. But I could tell she was furious inside. I wasn't going to just back down. This wasn't over. I drove off, my mind racing. Who the hell did Mrs. Clayton think she was? She was the president of the HOA. But this was my property, my parking spot, and I wasn't about to let her or anyone else push me around. As I went about my day, all I could think about was that moment, the way she had looked at me, the way she acted like she could tell me where I could park and where I couldn't. It felt like an abuse of power. And I wasn't the only one who had been affected by her. There were rumors going around about how she treated people. I had heard stories about her running the HOA with an iron fist, making life miserable for anyone who didn't follow her rules. But I wasn't about to let her get away with this. I thought about what to do next. Should I just go along with it? Or should I fight back? Maybe I could take this up with the board. But how much good would that really do? I had a feeling that this wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about something bigger, something deeper. It was about power, control. As the day went on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't know what Mrs. Clayton had in store, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her push me around without a fight. By the time evening rolled around, I had made up my mind. I was going to confront her, and I was going to make sure she understood that I wasn't afraid to stand up for myself. I wasn't just going to take her word for it. I was going to get answers. But before I could make my move, something strange happened. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the HOA portal. I opened it. A message from Mrs. Clayton. This is a formal warning. Your parking spot has been reassigned. Please park in your new spot by tomorrow. If you do not comply, further actions will be taken. Mrs. Clayton, HOA President. I couldn't believe it. She had already maddened her move. But what she didn't know was that this wasn't going to end the way she thought. I wasn't just going to follow her orders. I was going to turn the tables. The question is, what would you do if someone tried to take away your rights without explanation? Would you fight back, or would you let them win? Let me know in the comments below. I'm dying to hear your thoughts. The next day, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, like something was waiting to go wrong. I grabbed my coffee and sat at the window, staring out at the parking lot. My car was still parked in the same spot, the one that Mrs. Clayton had so generously reassigned to someone else. But what I couldn't shake was the thought that this wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. Something about it felt off. I tried to go about my day, but I couldn't stop thinking about that note. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed ridiculous. I mean, what kind of neighborhood was I living in where something as small as a parking spot could cause so much trouble? This wasn't a corporate office. It was a suburban neighborhood with picket fences and children playing in the yards. Yet here I was, locked in a battle with a woman who thought she could control everything. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't an isolated incident. I started noticing things, small things, the kind of things that you wouldn't normally pay attention to, but when everything starts to feel like a conspiracy, you see them. Like the way Mrs. Clayton seemed to always be lurking around when someone's grass grew just a little too tall, or when a mailbox was an inch too high. It was like she had an army of people watching over every little detail, and if you stepped out of line, there she was, with that same fake smile. And it wasn't just her. The whole HOA board had this presence about them. They weren't just keeping the neighborhood nice. They were running it like a dictatorship. It was petty. It was absurd. But it was real. I had never really paid attention to the HOA rules before. Sure, I'd read the pamphlet when I moved in. But who actually reads that stuff? I just figured they were there to keep the peace. But after the parking incident, I started looking closer. And what I found, well, it was enough to make my blood boil. There were rules for everything. The color of your front door, the height of your grass, the angle at which your mailbox should be positioned, even how many decorative rocks you could have in your yard. All these rules, all these little things that didn't matter at all, were being enforced by people who thought they had some kind of power over our lives. I wasn't the only one who was noticing it either. I started talking to my neighbors. I wasn't the kind of guy who usually got involved in neighborhood gossip, but this this was different. I needed to know if anyone else had been through the same thing. I spoke to Paul, the guy who lived a few doors down. He had been living in the neighborhood longer than I had. We started talking about Mrs. Clayton and the HOA and what I heard next. Well, it made my blood run cold. "Man, you're not the first one," Paul said, shaking his head. "Last year, they told Tom that his driveway was too cracked. He had to pay a fine to get it fixed, or they'd report him to the city. It was just a crack." I raised my eyebrows. "What did he do?" "He had no choice," Paul said. "He paid the fine. But they made sure to fine him again for his mailbox being an inch too high. They find something wrong with everybody. Nobody's safe. Rom them." My stomach sank. This was exactly what I had been afraid of. The HOA wasn't just some neighborhood watch group trying to keep things in order. They were a power-hungry machine, constantly looking for ways to make money and control people. And here I was, about to become their next victim. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I couldn't. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. This was about standing up to a group of people who had no right to control the way we lived. It was about showing them that we weren't afraid of their little rules and threats. And more importantly, it was about showing them that I wasn't just going to roll over and let them push me around. I spent the rest of the day reading through the HOA guidelines. I made notes. I looked for any loopholes, anything that could give me an edge. I had no idea how I was going to take them down, but I was going to find a way. I wasn't going to let them take my parking spot and my peace of mind, not without a fight. But just as I was getting ready to formulate a plan, that's when things took an even stranger turn. I received an unexpected letter. It wasn't from Mrs. Clayton. It wasn't from the HOA either. It was from the city. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. The letter was a notice of a neighborhood inspection. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint against my property. It didn't say who, but I knew exactly who it was. Mrs. Clayton was making her move, and I wasn't going to sit back and let her have the last laugh. This was only the beginning. What I didn't know, though, was that the real war was just about to begin. I couldn't shake the feeling. It felt like everything was slipping out of my control. I had no choice but to face it head on. That letter from the city about the neighborhood inspection had me fuming, and I was ready to put up a fight. But the question kept nagging at me. How? How could I fight back without making myself the target of every little rule the HOA wanted to enforce? The answer was simple. I had to break the rules. But not in some dramatic, all-in way. No, I wasn't going to just waltz around with a rebellious attitude. I needed to find a loophole, something subtle, something that would get under Mrs. Clayton's skin without giving her the satisfaction of catching me red-handed. It started with something small. I walked out to my front yard, looking at the perfectly trimmed grass, the mailbox with its precise angle, and the pristine line of hedges. Everything was in place. Everything was perfect. But perfection was exactly what the HOA wanted. And that's when I realized perfection was the enemy. I had to push the boundaries, just a little. I wasn't going to go overboard. I wasn't going to let the entire neighborhood burn just yet. But I was going to make a statement. So I walked over to my mailbox, which was supposed to be exactly 3 feet tall, no more, no less. And I did something simple. I shifted it. Not much, just an inch to the left. It was a tiny change, but it was enough to set the wheels in motion. I stood there for a moment, watching it, as if daring anyone to notice. The mailbox wasn't just off-center. It was a direct challenge. And I knew that Mrs. Clayton, the queen of rules, would be on the lookout. It didn't take long before I received the first warning. It came 2 days later, slipped under my door like a silent threat. It was a violation notice for my mailbox. It was out of compliance by exactly 1 inch. It was almost laughable. But the real kicker? The HOA had fine-tuned the wording of the violation so much that I had no choice but to either pay the fine or fix the mailbox. If I didn't comply, I'd be dragged into another meeting, with Mrs. Clayton leading the charge, of course. But I wasn't about to give in so easily. Instead of panicking, I smiled. This was it. This was the perfect opportunity to turn things around. I wasn't going to move the mailbox back. Oh no, I was going to escalate this. And I was going to escalate it the right way. I started looking through the fine print of the HOA rules, line by line, looking for any hint of weakness. There was one clause that caught my eye. It had something to do with excessive fines and unlawful enforcement practices. If I could prove that the HOA was fining people for petty violations, I could force them to back down. I wasn't just going to fight Mrs. Clayton. I was going to fight the whole HOA system. I made a copy of the violation notice, then printed out the relevant rule about fines and excessive enforcement. I had my plan. The next day, I went straight to the city hall, to the office where neighborhood complaints were processed. I walked in, held my head high, and handed the clerk the papers I had put together. "I'd like to file a complaint about the HOA," I said, keeping my voice calm. The clerk looked at me, probably wondering what the issue was with a mailbox being an inch off center. But I didn't care. I wasn't there to explain myself. I was there to win. As soon as I left the office, I got a call. It was Mrs. Clayton. "Why did you file a complaint?" she asked, her voice tight with anger. I could practically hear her jaw clenching through the phone. "I'm just following the rules," I replied with a smirk. "You're out of line and you're going to regret this," she snapped, hanging up before I could respond. But I didn't regret it. I felt like I was finally taking control. I wasn't just going to roll over and let her make the rules. This was my home. The next week, I received another letter. This one was a bit more official. The city had decided to conduct an audit of the HOA's enforcement practices. I couldn't believe it. My small act of rebellion had triggered a full-blown investigation. But I wasn't the only one. I wasn't the first person to be targeted by the HOA. As I talked to more neighbors, I realized how many of them were living in fear of Mrs. Clayton and her board. It was always something small, a mailbox, a cracked sidewalk, the length of a hedge. But the HOA used these petty violations to tighten their grip on the neighborhood. And the worst part? No one spoke out. They were all too scared to break the rules, to stand up for themselves. But not me. I had started something, and I wasn't going to stop until it was finished. As I walked back to my house, I looked over at the mailbox again. I had shifted it just an inch, but that inch was all it took to open the floodgates. And I knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of tension and anticipation. I couldn't help but replay the conversation with Mrs. Clayton in my head, her words still echoing. "You're going to regret this." She thought I was some easy target, another homeowner who would cower when faced with her petty power. But she was wrong. By the time I got home, the mail had arrived. I already knew what was coming. Another fine. It was as if they had nothing better to do than to hunt me down for every little detail. I ripped open the envelope. There it was. Another violation. This time they had it out for my fence. Apparently it was too tall by 2 inches. 2 inches. It wasn't even noticeable unless you were standing right next to it with a ruler. But to the HOA, it was enough to issue a fine. $250. I stood there, staring at the paper in disbelief. How much longer were they going to keep this up? Every time I took a step forward, they pulled me back too. But this time was different. I wasn't going to pay. I wasn't going to let them win. I had spent the last few days diving deeper into the HOA bylaws, And the more I read, the more I realized just how far they had overstepped their bounds. In one section of the guidelines, it clearly stated that no fine could be imposed without the approval of at least 2/3 of the board members. And guess what? I had been fined twice now, without any approval. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about the rules anymore. It was about control. And if I wanted to take my life back, I had to expose them for what they really were. A group of power-hungry bullies who had found a way to make money by preying on the residents of this neighborhood. I immediately called my lawyer. I was done playing their game. The first thing he said when I explained the situation was, "You're not the first one, you know." Apparently, people in the neighborhood had been putting up with this kind of nonsense for years. Every time a homeowner questioned a fine or challenged the HOA, the board would retaliate. They would slap you with more fines, send you threatening letters, even show up at your door. It was a cycle that never ended. But now I had something they didn't expect: the law. My lawyer advised me to file a formal complaint against the HOA for harassment and illegal enforcement of rules. It was the only way to force them to stop. So I took a deep breath and signed the paperwork. I sent it in, knowing that it was the beginning of a long, drawn-out battle. But the very next day, things got even stranger. I walked outside to find a final notice stuck to my front door. It was from the HOA, again. But this time the letter wasn't about my mailbox or my fence. It was about my lawn. Apparently, the HOA had decided that my grass was too green. Yes, you heard that right, too green. They claimed it was violating the neighborhood's aesthetic standards because it was unnaturally vibrant. I had been accused of making my lawn too perfect. This was getting ridiculous. It felt like they were just coming up with new ways to ruin my day. I read through the letter, my hands shaking in frustration. I had always taken pride in my lawn, but now I was being punished for it. And I knew what was coming next. Another fine, $200. It wasn't even about the money anymore. It was about forcing me to break. I took the letter and marched straight to Mrs. Clayton's house. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. When I knocked on her door, she opened it with that same smile, this time more smug than before. "Mr. Your last name," she said, clearly enjoying herself. "I see you've received another notice. How unfortunate." I didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "I'm done with this," I said, my voice low and firm. "You can't just keep making up rules to fine people. This isn't a game, Mrs. Clayton. This is my home, my life." Her smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "You signed the agreement when you moved in. All of these rules are in place to keep the neighborhood in order," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Yeah, well," I shot back, "maybe it's time for a change. Maybe it's time someone put a stop to your little reign of terror." She didn't respond. Instead, she just stared at me, her cold eyes narrowing. It was like she was trying to decide whether to laugh or threaten me again. But I didn't care. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I wasn't going to let her push me around anymore. I had the law on my side. I had proof that the HOA was breaking its own rules, and most importantly, I wasn't going to let her ruin my life. That night, I filed another complaint with the city. This time, it wasn't just about the fines. I was going after the HOA's entire system. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for the fight, because this wasn't just about a mailbox or a lawn anymore. It was about taking back control. And I wasn't going to stop until I had won. It was only a matter of time before Mrs. Clayton and her army of petty rule enforcers came after me again. I knew it was coming. She could smell weakness, and I wasn't about to show any. This time, however, I had a different plan. No more small rebellions. No more playing by their rules. I was going to do something bold, something drastic, something that would make them realize they couldn't control me. It started with a strange thought that hit me one morning while I was sitting in my car, staring out at the quiet suburban street. What if I could turn the tables on them by using their own system against them? What if I could declare their entire street unbuildable? I couldn't help but laugh at first. It sounded absurd, didn't it? I mean, who in their right mind would try to block a whole street from development? But then I thought about it more. What if the HOA's own rules could be used to trap them in their own game? I did some digging that day, researching every possible loophole, every regulation that could work in my favor. I found something. Somewhere buried in the local zoning laws was a clause that allowed any resident to petition to have a street declared unbuildable if certain conditions weren't met. For example, if the street wasn't maintained properly, or if the property owners weren't. Following city ordinances, they could be forced to stop development. And guess what? The HOA had been pushing development projects without proper permission. It was the perfect opening. I got to work right away. I filed the paperwork with the city, formally declaring that the street should be deemed unbuildable due to the HOA's negligence and unlawful actions. I included every violation, every fine, every bit of evidence that showed how the HOA had been overstepping their authority. I didn't care about their petty rules anymore. I was fighting for something bigger, something that would force the HOA to face the consequences of their actions. The moment I hit submit, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I had no idea how it would play out, but I knew this wasn't just a small act of defiance. This was a declaration of war. It wasn't just about a parking spot or a mailbox anymore. It was about taking down a system that had been abusing its power for too long. I didn't expect a quick resolution, but what came next was something I could have never predicted. 2 days later, I received a letter from the city. It was an official notice confirming that my petition had been accepted. I stared at the paper, stunned. I was in shock. I had actually done it. I had forced the city to acknowledge the corruption of the HOA. But as I was reading the letter, a chill ran down my spine. The next sentence was a warning. The city was sending a team to inspect the street. If they found that the HOA had been violating city codes, they would halt any development projects and potentially fine the entire HOA. And there it was. I had thrown a grenade into their peaceful little world, and I could hear it ticking. The next morning, I got a knock on my door. It was Mrs. Clayton. She stood there, her lips curled into a tight smile. "Mr. Vay, your last name," she said sweetly, but with an edge to her voice. "I see you've been busy." I didn't respond, but I could tell by the way her hands clenched at her sides that she was furious. "We need to talk," she said, her tone shifting to something colder. "You've made a mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with." "Funny," I said, stepping closer to the door. "I was just about to ask you the same thing. You don't know who you're dealing with either." Her smile faltered for a moment, and then she gave a sharp laugh. "You think you can take down the HOA? Do you honestly believe that the city is going to side with you?" "I don't need the city to side with me," I replied. "I'm not doing this for their approval. I'm doing this because it's the right thing." She scoffed. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a homeowner with a bad attitude." "I'm not a hero," I said, my voice steady. "But I sure as hell won't be your victim anymore." She stepped back, clearly rattled, but before she could say another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. And just like that, it was on. The next week, the city sent their team to inspect the neighborhood. I watched from my window as they walked down the street, taking notes and speaking with the residents. Mrs. Clayton and the rest of the HOA board were visibly on edge, trying their best to hide their panic. I had thrown a wrench into their carefully controlled little world, and I could see it was starting to unravel. A few days later, the official response came from the city. The HOA had been found guilty of multiple violations. The street development plans were officially halted, and they were fined a hefty sum for not following proper zoning and neighborhood regulations. But that wasn't the end of it. No, the real fun was just beginning. Suddenly, I wasn't just the rebellious neighbor who defied Mrs. Clayton. I was the guy who exposed the HOA for what they really were, and word got out. Other residents started speaking up. Neighbors who had been too afraid to say anything before were now joining me in the fight. The HOA's reign of terror was crumbling, and I couldn't help but smile. But just as everything seemed to be going my way, I got a message. It was from Mrs. Clayton. She wanted to talk. I thought the worst was over. The city had sided with me. The HOA was reeling from the fine. And Mrs. Clayton, well, she was probably stewing in her office, plotting her next move. I figured I had won. I should have known better. That night, as I sat in my living room, flipping through the mail, I noticed something odd. There was a thick envelope from the HOA. I hadn't seen one of these in a while. The last time they had sent me anything, it was a violation notice for my mailbox being 1 inch off center. But this time, something felt different. I ripped open the envelope, and inside was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a violation notice. It was a passive-aggressive letter. Dear Mr., your last name. We have noticed your recent actions and the steps you've taken to disrupt the neighborhood peace. While we understand your concerns, it is important to remember that the HOA's role is to maintain order and ensure that all residents adhere to community guidelines. You've caused unnecessary attention, and we strongly advise you to reconsider your approach. Please be aware that further disturbances will be met with additional fines and possible legal action. Sincerely, Mrs. Clayton, President, HOA. The words were carefully chosen, designed to provoke, yet hide behind a thin veil of politeness. It was a threat, but disguised as a warning. I smiled bitterly as I read it. This was their response to the city's ruling? They were playing the game of passive aggression, hoping to intimidate me into silence. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Yeah, I tossed the letter aside and grabbed my phone. I wasn't about to let them get the last word. I quickly composed my response. Instead of a direct confrontation, I decided to play their game. I took a screenshot of the letter, highlighting the most ridiculous parts, the threats wrapped in sugar-coated phrases, and posted it online. It wasn't just a response to them. It was a declaration to everyone in the neighborhood that I wasn't going to back down. It was time for everyone to see what kind of people they were dealing with. Within hours, my post went viral. Neighbors started commenting. They shared their own stories of fines, complaints, and the constant pressure from the HOA. What started as a single complaint grew into a movement. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had been intimidated, manipulated, and silenced by the HOA for years. Mrs. Clayton and her board had made one critical mistake. They underestimated how far I was willing to go. They thought they could shut me up with a little note. But now they had ignited something far bigger than they could control. Over the next few days, the note wars began. I kept posting every ridiculous letter they sent me, and my neighbors did the same. The HOA tried to retaliate with more letters, more threats, but the tide was turning. People started standing up. Mrs. Clayton's calls and emails became more frantic. I could hear the frustration in her voice whenever she tried to reach me. "You're making a huge mistake," she would say. But it was too late for that. The people were waking up, and they weren't going to let the HOA bully them anymore. Then something unexpected happened. A group of neighbors came to my door. At first, I thought it was more HOA enforcers ready to make another threat, but when I opened the door, I was met with smiling faces. "It's time to take this to the next level," Paul, the guy from down the street, said. "We've had enough of the HOA's control. We're with you." They handed me a petition to officially disband the HOA. They had been secretly gathering signatures from residents who were tired of living under the thumb of the HOA's control. They were ready to fight back. I was speechless. This was what I had wanted all along, a united front, and now it was happening. The petition quickly gained momentum. People who had been scared to speak up before were now coming out of the woodwork, eager to put their names on the line. Even the quietest residents were finally speaking up, sharing their stories of mistreatment and harassment. It was no longer just about me or my parking spot. It was about our collective freedom to live without the constant overreach of the HOA. But as the petition gained support, the HOA got desperate. They tried everything to stop it, threatening legal action, spreading rumors, and even accusing me of rallying against the neighborhood's best interests. But none of it worked. The people were done. It came to a head when the HOA board scheduled a final hearing to address the petition. I knew this was it. This was the moment where everything would either collapse or explode. I made my preparations, gathering as much evidence as I could about the HOA's illegal actions. But what surprised me most wasn't the hearing itself. It was what happened afterward. When the board saw that they were losing, they panicked. Instead of fighting back with logic or reason, they went straight for the personal attacks. They tried to make me look like the villain, accusing me of ruining the neighborhood's peace. But I wasn't having it. I stood up, calm and composed, and spoke my truth. This wasn't about the petty rules. This was about power and the abuse of it. And the people had had enough. The hearing ended with a unanimous vote. The HOA was officially dissolved. The relief was overwhelming. It was as if the air in the neighborhood had finally cleared. The constant pressure, the constant fear of being watched. It was all gone. But as I stood there, watching the people celebrate, one thought stuck with me. Would the victory last? Or would someone else come along trying to fill the void the HOA had left? I couldn't believe it. After all the letters, the fines, the threats, the chaos, it was over. The HOA was gone. The board members had packed up, their smug faces replaced by quiet defeat. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful again. But that peace didn't last long. In the days following the dissolution, the streets were alive with a strange mix of celebration and uncertainty. People who had never spoken to each other before were suddenly sharing stories of their experiences with the HOA, how they had been fined for the most trivial of things, how they had been bullied into silence. And they were all thankful, grateful even, for what I had done. But something inside me felt uneasy. It wasn't just the victory that left me unsettled. It was the silence that followed. The neighborhood was quieter than it had ever been. The people who had been so afraid of speaking up were now speaking their minds, but something was missing. What happened to the connection? What happened to the sense of unity we had when we were all standing against the same enemy? I walked down the street, looking at the houses, the lawns, the empty sidewalks. It should have felt like a victory, but it felt like an eerie calm. Was this what freedom really felt like? I had fought to get rid of the HOA, but now I wasn't sure what I had won. A few days later, I received a call. It was Paul, the guy from down the street, the one who had helped gather signatures for the petition. "We need to talk," he said. "About what?" I asked, feeling a sudden wave of dread. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said. I felt a pit in my stomach. I met Paul at a local coffee shop that afternoon. He looked different, more serious, more cautious. "We got what we wanted, right?" he started, his voice quiet. "The HOA is gone. But now people are talking, and not all of it is good." I raised my eyebrows. "What do you mean?" "People are happy. This is exactly what they wanted. No, Paul said, shaking his head. People are scared. We fought so hard to take down the HOA, but now that it's gone, no one knows what to do. There's no structure anymore. There's no leadership. People are starting to realize that they've gotten rid of the devil they knew, but now they're facing the unknown. I was stunned. He was right. For all the celebration and relief, something had been lost in the process. Without the HOA, the neighborhood had become a free-for-all. No rules, no guidelines, just chaos. That evening, as I walked back home, I noticed it more than ever. The lawns that had once been perfectly manicured were now overgrown. The streets that had once been quiet and orderly were suddenly filled with cars parked haphazardly. And it wasn't just the appearance of the neighborhood that was starting to unravel. It was the people. Everyone was on edge. No one knew what to do with their newfound freedom. And without the HOA's constant supervision, the cracked hex in the neighborhood's foundation started to show. The problem wasn't the HOA. It was what happened when the rules were taken away. I sat in my living room that night, contemplating what had just happened. The whole neighborhood had wanted to be free of the HOA. But now, we were all asking ourselves if we had made the right choice. I had taken down the tyrant, but what if the real problem wasn't the HOA at all? What if it was us? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The HOA had been an oppressive force, but in its absence, something else had emerged. A sense of chaos, a void that no one seemed willing to fill. That's when I realized the true victory wasn't just getting rid of the HOA. It was about creating something better, something sustainable, a way for the neighborhood to thrive without fear of oppression. But that would take more than just tearing down the old system. It would take real change. I wasn't sure how to make that change happen. I wasn't sure if I even had the answers. But one thing was certain. The fight wasn't over, and the real work had just begun. As I walked back into my house, I realized that the hardest part wasn't fighting the HOA. The hardest part was figuring out what comes after the fight. The hardest part was learning how to live in a world without rules, or learning how to create the right ones.